welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of a conference. So our first keynote speaker, Dr. Louis Manan, is a chair professor of English at Harvard University and also a Harvard College professor. And among his numerous illustrious publications, the Metaphysical Club won the Pulitzer Prize for History, the Francis Parkman Prize for the Society of American Historians, and also the Heartland Prize. The Heartland Prize from the Chicago Tribune. I'm sorry. Professor Menand has been an associate editor of the New Republic and also an editor at the New Yorker and contributing editor of the New York Review of Books, in all of these, magazines that I regularly frequent. And he has been a staff writer at the New Yorker for 2 decades and counting. And in 2016, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. And for his keynote today, Professor Menand will speak broadly issues concerning historiography while focusing in particular on aspects of cultural history as it pertains to the notion of Cold War. And the screen is yours, Luke.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And it's very nice to be able to talk to you about the Cold War and writing Cold War history. I'm a cultural historian. So my perspective on the Cold War era is shaped by the focus on art and ideas rather than on foreign policy. Obviously, there's a relationship between art and ideas and geopolitics, particularly after 1945, when international relations was on the front burner, so to speak, of many countries' agendas. And cultural products in that period were circulated around the world and sometimes by government agencies. So parsing the relationship between art and ideas and geopolitics is part of writing cultural history of the period after 1945. But I'm trying to explain the art and the politics on the ideas and how they arise and what they mean. Probably few readers of history are interested in questions of historiography, but I think most historians are. I certainly am. And for me, trying to solve historiographic problems is probably the reason I write history. I'm trying to capture something that's very elusive, and that's the sense of the way it was at a different time. I'm trying to bring a vanished world to life on the page. When you undertake historical research, 2 truths that once seemed banal come to seem profound. And the first one is that your knowledge of the past, apart occasionally from a limited visual record and the odd unreliable survivor, comes entirely from written documents. You're almost completely cut off by a wall of print or words from the life you've set out to represent. You can't observe historical events, you can't question historical actors, you can't even know most of what has never been written down. What has been written down, therefore, takes on an importance that may be spurious. A few lines in a memoir, a snatch of recorded conversation, a letter fortuitously preserved, an event in a diary, noted in a diary, they all become luminous with significance, even though they're merely the bits that have floated to the surface. The historian clings to them while somewhere below, the huge submerged wreck of the past sinks silently out of sight. One instinct in doing historical research is to know when to keep dredging stuff up, and another is knowing when to stop. You stop when you feel you've got it. So novelists sometimes say that they invent a character, put the character into a situation, and just observe what the character does. And of course, the historian's characters have to be consistent with the real person, what that person actually did say or do. There's a sense in which this can happen spontaneously. The person that you imagine as an historian keeps behaving, and every time there's a new situation like that person. And this gives us descriptions of the conditions of that person's life, also plausibility, because the world is turning under the character's marching feet. And my own work is very biographical for that reason, because it helps to bring the world of the past to life. The intuition about what it was like to be alive somewhere at some time, how people thought, how the world looked to them, is worth 1,000 facts. Because once we're equipped with the intuition, every fact becomes sensible. Residual positivism makes facts and intuition seem antithetical, knowledge versus verstehen. But this has to put our priorities backwards, because intuitive knowledge, a sense of what life was like when we were not there to experience, is precisely the knowledge that we seek. This is why historical research is an empirical enterprise and history writing is an imaginative one. We read histories for information, but what is it that we want the information for? We want the information in order to acquire the ability to understand it. At some point, we want the facts to burst and just to feel we're inside the moment. That's not that different from what novels do. So those are my general remarks about history writing. I think there's two big differences between political history and cultural history. And the first is that when you're writing cultural history, you have to explain what things mean. You have a work of art, you have a book, you have a poem, you have to explain what it means. That's really the whole point of it. And this requires knowing what the artist or writer intended, so far as you can determine that, and how the work was understood by the people who first saw it or read it or listened to it. And these are not always the same thing. And figuring those two things out involves figuring out the context, the conditions of production that made it possible to make this thing that you're trying to explain, and the conditions of perception, how people received it, how they understood it. How was the work distributed, to whom, how is it mediated by critics, reviewers, marketing, promotion? There's always a cultural infrastructure that makes work possible, that shapes the way it's received. For these reasons, as I said, for me, a key part of cultural history is biography, because you're trying to plot the intersection between an individual life history and larger social forces, demographic, economic, technological, institutional, geopolitical. For when you're talking about an iconic figure in cultural history, you're usually looking at a very short stretch of time during which that person managed to change the game. It was really more than 3 or 4 years. For me, that's the moment I want to understand and capture. How did this happen? Why did it happen? When it happened? What was the backstory? What were the downstream consequences? Basic assumption for me, therefore, is that everything is potentially relevant. The more you can find out, the better, from the technology available to the sources of capital, the legal regime, personal life of the artist or writer. The meaning of the work of art, its significance, its function in a place, its function of its place in a historical, biographical, textual chain, simultaneously in relation to everything else that's in circulation at the time of its appearance. Cultural goods are always competing against other cultural goods, sometimes in different media. But to see how things work, you can't fly at 30,000 feet. You have to get a sense of life down on the street, because that's where the stuff gets made. I think in much cultural and certainly in a lot of intellectual history, works of art and books are abstracted from these contexts that I'm describing. Intellectual histories frequently take a books talking to books approach, in which historical and biographical data are treated as wallpaper, and the works themselves are like a chain of paper dolls. Kant wrote something, Hegel wrote something, Marx wrote something. The works don't transmit so fluidly. The chief factors in cultural transmission are misprision, which is misunderstanding or mistranslation, and sublation, suppression of some element that will eventually reemerge. Cultural histories of the Cold War differ from political histories, I think, in 3 major ways. First is periodization. Most cultural histories, including mine, I just wrote a book on the Cold War called The Free World, cover the first 20 years of the Cold War, from 1947, the year of the Truman Doctrine, and Kennan's X article, spelling out the policy of containment, to 1967, which is the year revelations about the CIA's covert funding operations were made, and the US was committed to military victory in Vietnam. That's a period when people feel, do cultural history, you can put the modifier Cold War in front of various terms in a meaningful way, like the Cold War novel or Cold War University. In Vietnam, it's a fitting boundary for that because it was a crisis of containment policy, the very thing that started, sort of framed US in the Cold War. It had a distinct effect on art and thought. It politicized everything. Another way that cultural histories of the Cold War period differ from political histories is that they tend to be very US-centric. The United States is certainly a key player in cultural developments after 1945. I think that the main phenomenon of that first 20 years of the Cold War is that the United States moved from the periphery of world culture to the center of an increasingly global or international culture. But everything was not created in the United States. Things just passed through it. It's also the case, as I mentioned earlier, obviously that cultural diplomacy was a major government activity in the first 20 years of the Cold War. And it's out of this period that conceptions of American cultural hegemony and so forth tend to arise. But it's a consequence, it's a tendency among American historians, cultural historians, to picture the rest of the world as passive, as affected by Americanization, but not affecting it. This is obviously mistaken. One of the most distinctive features of the post-war history is the degree of cultural mobility, not only between the United States and Western Europe, but globally, including cultural exchanges with places like India and Japan. Of course, this kind of mobility predates 1945. In the case of Cold War culture, it really begins in 1933 with the rise of Hitler, when the United States served as a sanctuary for European artists and intellectuals. But the story of post-war culture is not imaginable without this flow of people and goods across the oceans. Political histories of the Cold War today are all global, but cultural histories are less so. Finally, in political history, interpretations of the Cold War have gone through three phases. In the beginning, starting really right after 1945, American historians generally explain the Cold War as a product of Soviet actions, and particularly the behavior of Joseph Stalin. Starting in 1959, with the publication of The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, William Appleman Williams, Cold War history entered what's called the Revisionist Phase, in which the Cold War was now generally explained as a product of deliberate American policy, specifically instruments of American business interests. The revisionist view was succeeded by the post-revisionist view, beginning with Gaddis's The United States, the Origins of the Cold War, 1972. So post-revisionism sees the Cold War as a consequence of actions on both sides. And although this interpretation appears to allow for the possibility that things might have turned out differently, post-revisionists tend to see the Cold War as inevitable. Cultural history of the Cold War seems to me still in the revisionist phase. Another way to put it is to say that cultural historians, especially literary critics, are still fighting the Cold War. And that's not the ideal spirit in which to write history. Indifference is impossible, but agnosticism is certainly attainable. I don't think we can transcend the politics of history writing. It's just good to take the Cold War simply as a fact of the matter, and then try to figure out how that fact affected art and ideas, including art and ideas that on the surface seem to have little to do with Cold War politics. For a while, the most influential book on the cultural Cold War was Francis Soner Saunders' book, published in 1999. And that book is, of course, chiefly about the role the CIA played in cultural diplomacy. I read the book when it came out, and was very excited by it. And I expected when I started writing my book some years later that I would duplicate many of her findings. But instead, when I was doing my own research, I found her book extremely unreliable, not only tendentious, which it is in places, but also just inaccurate. So I'm going to give you a few examples, then get into the question of cultural diplomacy. Her book has this to say about George Kennan, quote, in a speech at the National War College in December 1947, it was Kennan who introduced the concept of, quote, the necessary lie, end quote, as a vital constituent of American post-war diplomacy. The communists, he said, had won a strong position in Europe, so immensely superior to our own, through unabashed and skillful use of lies. They have fought us with unreality, with irrationalism. Can we combat this unreality successfully with rationalism, with truth, with honest, well-meant economic assistance, he asked, end quote. No, America needed to embrace a new era of covert warfare to advance her democratic objective against Soviet deceit. So this is a direct quotation from Kennan that I read you. And the citation she provides is George Kennan, National War College Address, December 1947, quoted in the International Herald Tribune, May 28, 1997. In fact, there is no quotation from Kennan in the International Herald Tribune for May 28, 1997, or in any other issue of that newspaper. Although Kennan did speak at the National War College in December 1947, he did not say the words she says he said. What he did say is this, quote, "The communist strong position in Europe, so immensely superior to our own, not by economic means, but through unabashed and skillful use of lies. They have fought us with unreality, with irrationalism. Can we combat this unreality successfully with rationalism, with truth, with honest, well-meant economic assistance? Perhaps not, but those are the only weapons we possess short of war." What Kennan actually said is completely the opposite of what Saunders said he said. He did not use the words necessary lie in his talk at the National War College. As far as I know, he never used that phrase anywhere. But if you Google the words Kennan, necessary lie, you will get a lot of hits quoting Saunders' book. Another example of a canard that's become standard, Saunders claims that Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, promoted abstract expressionist art as a form of, quote, benevolent propaganda for foreign intelligentsia, quote. So those are supposed to be Barr's words. It's a false attribution. That phrase actually was used many years later by a critic of museum policies, Max Kozloff. It comes from his article called American Painting During the Cold War and Art Forum in 1973. It's the first of the revisionist accounts of American painting that persists to this day. Something I'll say more about in a minute. So those are just two examples of things that are just completely misquoted. So Saunders did a lot of research. She interviewed many people. No question there's a big subject there. But the book as a whole is warped by persistent overreading of the evidence or just inventing its own evidence. I think the overreaching part is true of a lot of Cold War cultural history, even when it's not sloppy. The Cold War and the CIA in particular are given too much power as explanatory variables. This is largely because the Cold War has been expanded to include concepts that have a meaning in history independent of the Cold War context. So you get terms like Cold War liberalism or Cold War science or Cold War individualism. The implication is that the words Cold War cast a shadow on any term they're used to modify. This seems like an unexamined assumption. One way we can clarify our assumptions about what it means for art and ideas to have been produced and received in the early Cold War is to reconstruct the conditions of production and reception. This is probably the most frequently asserted claim in revisionist cultural history, is that abstract expressionist painting was weaponized in the Cold War. Let's examine the actual circumstances in which the paintings were made and distributed. Even people who, after the fall of France, imagined that New York would replace Paris as the capital of modern art, didn't think it would happen right away. Americans weren't ready for it. In 1941, Jackson Pollock's future dealer, Sidney Janis, warned that what was needed for modern art to thrive in the United States was, quote, an extensive and imaginative merchandising plan aimed to encourage a vast American public to participate by purchasing works of their time, end quote. In other words, Americans just didn't buy paintings to begin with. So for there to be an art world in the United States, there had to be an audience that was going to collect the art or buy the art. 5 years later, so that's 1941. When the war's over, 1946, Clement Greenberg wrote an article in L'État Moderne, Sartre's journal, that the sort of Americans he said, the sort of Americans interested in art are, quote, semi-educated, credulous old maids and rearguard visionaries, end quote. To replace Paris, New York needed galleries, dealers, collectors, curators, museum officials, and trustees, critics, and a public audience for contemporary art. An art world is what sociologists call it. And these all came into being. They just didn't come into being overnight. For one thing, there was no American-style modern art in 1946, and little tolerance in the United States for modern art generally. That year, the State Department purchased 150 works by contemporary American artists for a traveling exhibition called Advancing American Art. And it was sent to two editions of it. One was sent to Europe, one was sent to Latin America. Only a handful of those paintings were abstract, none of them by major artists. And the star of the exhibition was John Marin, who was 76 years old, representing the state of modern painting circa 1915. He painted boats, basically. The exhibition quickly ran into political trouble, however. Look magazine, which is one of the big picture magazines, ran a story with the headline, "Your Money Bought These Paintings." Paintings were modernist in style, sort of semi-surrealist, semi-cubist, not representational, most of them. Your money bought these paintings. And President Truman was asked about the exhibition. He ridiculed it and said, supposed to have said, "If that's art, I'm a Hottentot." The show was pulled mid-tour by the Secretary of State, George Marshall, and he vowed the State Department would never buy art again, because this was taxpayer money, was the whole problem the State Department was using to buy these paintings. The story is interesting because they, when the exhibitions were pulled, that government had these paintings on its hands that it was the owner of, and it basically sold them at auction. These were George O'Keeffe's. There's some pretty great paintings in the group. And they sold them for nothing, like $50 in a warehouse. And a lot of them ended up in Southern universities, which is interesting. The University of Georgia has a big collection of these paintings that are bought in a warehouse. In 1946, the year of the Advancing American Art debacle, the Museum of Modern Art was still committed to European modernism. It was wary of contemporary American art, and it demonstrated no special interest in abstract expressionism. Even after Jackson Pollock's breakthrough show in 1949, the museum turned down a chance to buy Autumn Rhythm for $8,000. American collectors who bought art bought European art, often because the franc was cheap from Paris galleries, not American galleries. And the art market in general in the United States was depressed until the end of the Korean War in 1953. Saunders claimed that the promotion of abstract expressionism was pursued covertly. She says, quoting another scholar, quote, "As part of a deliberate maneuver to quieten opposition to the museum's cultivation of abstract expressionism, Alfred Barr followed a this is the quote, two-pronged policy that for reasons of tact or diplomacy was never acknowledged, but was manifested especially in the museum's exhibition program," close quote. So she's quoting somebody as saying that Barr disguised his preference for abstract expressionism by pursuing a two-pronged policy in his exhibitions of painting. So the scholar she cites is named Lynn Zelavansky, and it's an article that she wrote on a MoMA curator named Dorothy Miller. In fact, Zelavansky was making the opposite point. The two-pronged approach was required because MoMA was not interested in contemporary American painting. It was frequently criticized for that, including abstract expressionism. It was committed to European modernism. Two-pronged approach was designed to disguise the preference for European painting over American painting, not the other way around. The museum was notoriously slow to acquire work by abstract expressionists. For 7 years, there was only one Mark Rothko in the Museum of Modern Art. For 15 years, there was only one painting by Franz Klein in the museum. So in the United States, there was not much of a market for American art or any art after the war. In 1946, by a conservative calculation, there were 73 art galleries in New York City. Only a handful showed contemporary American art. Annual art sales in New York in 1946, about $6 million, was less than half annual sales in Paris before the war. In 1953, Eleanor Ward, the owner of the Stable Gallery in New York, had a show that included all the major abstract expressionists, except Rothko and Still, Clifford Still, who were turning down group shows. It included Jackson Pollock's last strip painting, Blue Poles, and works by de Kooning and Klein. Not a single painting was sold. 1955, when an arts journalist asked gallery owners whether they thought it likely that the center of international art will shift from Paris to New York, none said it already had, and most doubted that it ever would. The abstract expressionists did not enjoy robust sales until 1956, the year of Pollock's death, which primed the market because it meant that the number of Pollocks in the world was now finite. In 1957, the Museum of Modern Art finally did purchase Autumn Rhythm for $30,000. In 1958, Time magazine reported a surge in prices for abstract expressionist works, though noted that many of the buyers were European. Stabilization of the franc in 1959 helped the American market, since it was no longer cheaper to buy art in Paris. Abstract expressionism was still regarded with distaste by many mainstream art critics. In 1956, shortly after Pollock's death, the Herald Tribune's art critic Emily Granauer called the drip paintings, quote, formless, repetitious, empty, but in many cases extremely decorous, end quote. And she generally ignored shows by abstract expressionist painters. In 1959, the lead art critic at the New York Times, John Kennedy, referred to abstract expressionism as, quote, a Frankenstein's monster, end quote. This is 1959. Nor was abstract expressionism a visible presence in Europe. Pollock had shows in 1950 in Venice and Milan of work from Peggy Guggenheim's collection. She'd moved to Italy in 1947. All of them early works pre-Drip. His abstract work was featured in 2 gallery shows in Paris, 1951 and 1952, organized by the curator Michel Tapier, with the idea of setting up a conversation between European and American painting. That one of those exhibitions traveled to the Institute of Contemporary Art in London, 1953, which is the first time Pollock had ever been seen in England. And the work was important for the independent group artists, who were British artists who became the first pop artists, but popular response to Pollock was hostile. No American museum, dealer, or government agency sponsored those shows. Tapier borrowed the canvases from a friend of Jackson Pollock's named Alfonso Osorio. Except for work by American artists living in Paris, almost all the contemporary art by Americans seen by Europeans in the 50s was on loan to a European museum. While those museums displayed American art, they did not buy it. 1958, there was not a single painting by Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell, or Mark Rothko in a European museum. There were 2 Pollocks. Both were in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. The museum, under the direction of Willem Sandberg, was dedicated to avant-garde art, and both of them were gifts of Peggy Guggenheim. No European museum purchased a Pollock until 1960, when the Tate bought a number 23, painted in 1948. By contrast, in 1960, that same year, American museums owned 13 works by the Russian-born French painter Nicolas de Staël, Pollock's contemporary. Mark Rothko did not have a solo exhibition in Europe until 1961. De Kooning did not have one until 1967. By then, Warhol had had 10 European exhibitions, and Robert Rauschenberg had had 15. The idea that Europeans were a passive audience for American art is the kind of US-centric impression that I talked about earlier. Abstraction began in Europe around 1910. The European painters were making abstract art after 1945, had various names: art informel, tachisme, art brut, art autre, and gesture painting. They did not look to Americans for models. That was the art that Tapier was trying to put in dialogue with Pollock in 1952. An exhibition of more than 100 works by American artists that toured Europe in 1956, called Modern Art in the United States. By far the most popular painting was Christina's World by Andrew Wyatt, the hyperrealist painting, which MoMA had bought in 1949. Although the Pollocks made a big impression on London audiences, much of it was negative. It's not the case that Pollock's work or abstract expressionism generally received special support from the government or American museums. The message of art exhibitions sent abroad was that there was not one American style of painting. On the contrary, the United States was a place where a diversity of styles could flourish, unlike the Soviet Union, which did have an official aesthetic, socialist realism, and state censorship. The absence of an official aesthetic is what signified freedom. So, for example, although Pollock had 4 works in a show called 12 Contemporary American Painters and Sculptors that traveled to Paris, Zurich, and other places in Europe in 1953 and 54, the emphasis was on diversity. Other artists include Ben Shahn, Edward Hopper, Alexander Calder, John Marin, and Stuart Davis. An exhibition devoted exclusively to abstract expressionism that finally did come to Europe was in 1958. That was the New American Painting, assembled at the request of European museums by the Museum of Modern Art. The exhibition was produced by MoMA's International Program of Exhibitions, which had been created in response to the failure of the Advancing American Art exhibitions in 1947. And the original idea for the show came from a German, the director of the Kunsthalle Museum in Basel. Reaction to the New American Painting was mixed. Newspaper critics in Europe were mostly hostile. A reviewer in Milan wrote, "It is not new, it is not painting, it is not American." The European artists were impressed, particularly by Pollock, whose paintings contradicted his reputation as a wild man. But they were not shocked because they had been making abstract works themselves. Abstract art was no longer new in the United States either, because Johns and Rauschenberg had had their shows at Castelli Gallery. Pollock was dead, and the abstract expressionist moment was over. This is 1958. The art by the Americans that arguably conquered the world, if we want to use that language, was pop art. It took abstract expressionism almost 10 years to achieve critical and commercial success. It took pop art about 10 months. Good in 1962, when pop art burst on the scene and art world infrastructure had finally in place. Abstract expression didn't have that. In 1955, there were 123 art galleries in New York City. 1960, there were 154. 1959, a de Kooning show at the Janus Gallery sold out, $150,000. There was a boom in museum attendance. The opening of Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum building on Fifth Avenue in 1959 was mobbed. In 1960, the Metropolitan Museum of Art had 4 million visitors. 1961, it had 5 million. Attendance at the Louvre that year was 1.5 million. By 1965, there were 246 art galleries in New York City. So now you could make pop art and you get people who were going to show it and people who were going to buy it. As Greenberg had predicted almost 20 years before, Americans were buying contemporary art and American museums were showing it, and pop was the main beneficiary. In 1962 and 63, there were pop art exhibitions at the Pasadena Art Museum, the Guggenheim, the Mary Atkins Museum of Fine Arts in Kansas City, the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, the Oakland Art Museum, the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo. Pop art flooded Europe in the 1960s. Jackson Pollock never set foot outside the United States. Rassenberg's grand prize for painting at the Venice Biennale in June 1964 was received, even though Rassenberg was not a pop artist, as the triumph of pop. By the time he won, his work had already traveled to Rome, Dusseldorf, Paris, Kassel, Sao Paulo, Milan, Vienna, Amsterdam, Caracas, London, Darmstadt, Stockholm, Tokyo, and Turin. In September 64, following the Biennale, Daniel Cordier, who had given Rauschenberg his first solo show in Paris in 1961, as he was closing his gallery, he wrote a statement saying, quote, "Americans have taste, curiosity, and the means to satisfy them. That is why New York, once merely a market, will soon become a predominant cultural center. We may be headed toward a period in which artistic centers scattered all over the world will reject the supremacy of any single one. Be that as it may, Paris's role in this area is now a thing of the past." Marcel Duchamp said, "There is no art world anymore, no capital here or there. The Americans persist in wanting to smash the Paris hegemony. They are idiots because there is no hegemony in Paris or in New York." Of course, that's the cultural world that we live in today. So I'm going to end by returning to the historiographic question about periodization. So periodization is one of the most vexed problems in history writing because we have to do it. So when we have to disaggregate these stretches of time, but a lot of the concepts we rely on are essentially arbitrary, like the decade. What does that mean? We just have 10 figures. That's why we have decades. Nature doesn't recognize a decade, or the zeitgeist or something, or generations. And the bigger problem, of course, is that not everything develops at the same speed. So often you'll see in cultural history books a kind of set of timelines in which developments in art, literature, and so on are tied to historical events. But those things are all developing at different speeds. They aren't all happening at the same level at the same time. So it's very hard to chart it chronologically. I would say if we wanted to make the Cold War do some of the work of periodization, which is one of the reasons that we use the term, it seems to me we're overinflating it if we use it to describe the whole period from 1947 to 1991. Simply in terms of US-Soviet relations, the relevant period begins in 1917, when the US broke off diplomatic relations with Russia. And if we want to limit the period to years when the US-Soviet tensions were on the front burner, so to speak, we should make it cover 1947, the year of the Truman Doctrine, 1956, the year of the Hungarian Revolution, and Stalin's secret speech. Those events ended the appeal of communism for European intellectuals, and they marked the point at which the United States redirected its cultural diplomacy and political meddling to other parts of the world. They felt that Cold War in Europe had been won by 1956. The ideological struggle was over. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly after the American intervention in Vietnam, the Cold War turned into an arms race, and the work of the cultural historian is done. All right, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for Professor Manan for this very interesting historical tour of aspects of American contemporary art, and I would like to kind of pick up on a few themes that pertaining to historiography at large, and then we can probably go back and forth a couple of times and open up for conversation, Q&A. So as you point out, and all historians are mindful of how we write, right? Capture or construct history, given the elusive nature of the past? And how do we, quote, bring a vanished world to life on the page, unquote? And oftentimes, as you put it, the more material you dredge up and the more elusive your subject becomes. So, and knowing when to stop is then, what we have learned to do, right? We learn to settle and accept the kind of incompleteness of our knowledge of the past. And I would add also that from time to time, we are confronted with not just the incompleteness, but also the completing versions of the past. And history is comprised of not merely facts, but also a narrative that assembles and frames facts, a frequently fraught process of omission, elimination, and embellishment, and at times pure fancy, if not fabrication or improvisation, as in the case of, you mentioned Francis Saunders' The Cultural Cold War, right? Which turns out to be unreliable source of facts. And as you put it, quote, historical research is an empirical enterprise and history writing is an imaginative one, or what I call storytelling. And incidentally, I like to call everybody's attention to our newly launched academic journal. I have to do a little plug-in here, appropriately called Global Storytelling Journal of Digital and Moving Image. It's not a history journal, but a journal that touches upon history and storytelling and puts storytelling at the center of our inquiry by examining how storytelling shapes our perception of the past, current, and future. So when it comes to storytelling, historians dredge up the past so as to make sense of how we get to where we are, right? So the process of digging up the past is purposeful, and it's not random, and frequently guided by our own moral conviction. Of course, if not the pressure of tenure for those in academia, the drill, and also rhetorical persuasion, and it drives towards a final verdict or closure of some sort, right? So in a way, writing about the past or doing history is akin to the exercise of, shall we say, appraisal or evaluation. To use Stanley Fischer's terms, evaluation is an act of persuasion rather than demonstration, in quote, which is kind of interesting, kind of but of course, unlike cultural critics who do their best to persuade, right? Cultural historians demonstrate meticulously in order to make a point or make points. So now let me shift gears slightly to comment on the three major ways you identify that separates cultural histories of the Cold War from political histories of the period. And the first, as you say, and I couldn't agree more, and I want to highlight is the challenge of periodization, which varies depending on what counts as milestone moments or events, and also who is doing the counting, right? For what, from whose perspective, from what perspective. And secondly, you suggest that, quote, another way that cultural histories of the Cold War differ from political history is that we tend to be US-centric. And you elaborate on how the US culture itself is the product of a confluence of many other cultural influences, as in the case of US and European exchange in the art war during a particular period of time. So one thought I have concerns the subject of our historical inquiry and how history might look like with an even more decentralized or diffused approach. So by that, I'm thinking along the lines of Enos School, right? A group of 20th century French historians who understood history in terms of a complex social development rather than easy political frames and formulas such as Marxist analysis, for instance. And the annals school also famously rejected great man accounts of history that focused on kings, emperors, generals, and other prominent figures, curators, for instance, right? And instead of studying the lives and habits of ordinary people, spectators, for instance, among many other factors that contribute to the historical trajectory of particular societies or periods. And transplanting their perspective to cultural history, how might we capture the cultural experience of ordinary folks under the larger rubric of Cold War? And then you're absolutely right to call out that the Cold War is given too much power as explanatory valuable, which can be a liability, actually, indeed, that restricts our interpretive horizons and analytical possibilities. So with or without Cold War as a framework, how does modern art, European or American, or in your elaboration, for instance, play a role in the lives of the public or ordinary folks, right? And to what extent they matter, these matter outside the confines of museums, salons, and private collections of collectors, right? So, and moving beyond Cold War as a convenient, at times, perhaps just pure intellectual laziness, as a catchphrase. So, what are the kind of alternatives that alternative ways that we can utilize to address these encounters, experiences, or movements, right? Or the lack of which, for that matter. And finally, you're absolutely right that historians are still fighting the Cold War over, who are the perpetrators and who are the winners and losers and so on and so forth. And the way I see it, the real problem is not with the Cold War as too broad a periodization tool in historical summation, but Cold War as a mentality that shapes the way we perceive the world, and then closes the world for us, and that divides us, and also our shared humanities. So those are some of my preliminary thoughts, as I very much inspired by your talk and by the things you wrote. So I think I should stop here so that I give you a chance to reply or respond or comment, and with time we can probably open the floor for Q&A.
Sure, I'm happy to hear from people out there in the audience too. Well, thank you for your response. I think the thing you want me to comment on is the point about the relationship between the general public, or ordinary people, I think is the term you used, and the art movements that we were talking about, for example. There's not a lot of relationship, because if you were to probably ask the average American who Jackson Pollock was, they would have no idea what you were talking about. So I think, so from that point of view, when you're talking about art and ideas at that level, you're talking about a fairly elite group of people who know kind of, or part of what's going on, or understand what's going on. And that would be true today, or probably any historical period. But I would say this, Jackson Pollock is an ordinary person too. I mean, I think one of the I think one of the ways that you can get sort of lose sight of how things happen is by treating iconic figures like Pollock or Warhol or Elvis Presley or George Cannon or whoever they are on or rent as somehow outside of history. And they're not. They're just as much a history as you and me. And they have to figure out, like all of us do, how to do their thing, whatever their thing is, writing a book or painting a painting and singing a song. And they have no better idea about where the paradigm is going in their field than anybody else does. where's the paradigm going in my field? My field's literary studies. I have no idea where it's going. Nobody knows where it's going. But we're all trying to do our work. So I think the same thing's true of all these figures that I'm talking about in our conversation that I write about in my book. That you have to think of them as people like everybody else, dealing with the same confusion and uncertainty and material constraints and conditions that everybody deals with. And that helps you understand, appreciate what they were able to do. A lot of it just by accident or by not really understanding what the consequences would be of throwing canvas on the floor and throwing paint on it. I mean, he wasn't thinking, oh, this is what the next thing's going to be. Just thought, I have to make a painting. The walls aren't big enough in my house to put a canvas on. I'll put it on the floor and see what it looks like. And it looked pretty good. It turned out he was really, really good at it. Made these incredible paintings, but it was an accident. And a lot of art is like that. A lot of stuff is like that. So you want to get, so the way I put it is that you want to get down to the street level. So the street level, you're not really sure where you're going. And that's just the way those people experienced it. So that doesn't duplicate the ordinary person's experience of life, but it's just, they're not different from ordinary people. They're just people who happen to make paintings as opposed to, running a grocery store or whatever. So that's one answer to it. And another thing I would say, though, this has more to do with the Annals school example that you gave, is that I do think that there are underlying social and historical trends, not at the longue durée level that the Annals scholars take it, hundreds of years, but even in the relatively short term of the first 20 years of the Cold War, there's very powerful forces that have a big effect on what's possible to do. And these forces are partly demographic, having to do with two things. One is migration, which happens after 1933, as I mentioned. There's a kind of brain drain out of Central Europe and eventually out of France. And then also population growth in all the countries are really after 1945, but particularly pronounced in the United States because of a very long, as you know, a very long period of high birth rates up to 1964. So that has an effect on what's possible and what people can do at every level of society. So that's something you have to keep in mind, that in a way that has more immediate effect on people's lives than geopolitics. And second big change or big source of change is technological development. So just to give an example of where you can see that happening, having enormous impact on what gets done, is in popular music, because the 45, which is the single, 45 RPM single, is invented around 1946 or 47, and then the album is the 33 and a third RPM. Album is developed about a year or two later. So those are new methods of distributing music. There's also the development of jukeboxes, which become very big after 1945. So you can carry 200 songs, which means that popular music of all different genres can be put into one machine. Anybody can play it. You don't have to listen to it on the radio. There's a proliferation of independent radio stations. There's a lot of things, and there's transistor radios are invented. New cars all have radios in them. There's suddenly all kinds of new ways to consume music. It becomes much more central to people's lives than it was before that. It was a much more complicated process to hear music. Now you could easily get it cheaply and listen to it anywhere. And that creates conditions for things like rock and roll. That's the music for teenagers. Suddenly teenagers have an ability to access that music that they didn't have in the 30s. This is a different world. So those are things that happen outside the control of any individual artist, is what I'm trying to say. Artists can't control those things. I would say the big feature of the period, there's two big features of the period, I think, that bigger than the Cold War, not bigger than the Cold War, but let's put it this way, equally important to understand to try to get what's going on in the world. One is decolonization. From 1945 to 1970, there's just enormous decolonization around the world because all the European powers had to give up their empires. They couldn't afford them anymore. And so that completely changes the world map. That's the biggest thing that ever happened, really, in modern history. And that's more important than the Cold War. And that the American Civil Rights Movement, which American historians tend to think of in very American context, is actually part of that. That's how the rest of the world saw it. So that's one big thing. And the second big thing that's unusual about this period is that between 1950 and 1973, there was a record low gap or lack of a gap between the income of the top earners and the middle class. It was the lowest in history. So the top earners, top 1% or top 10% own a far smaller percentage of the wealth than they did before 1945, before 1939. And world economic growth was incredibly robust. So between 50 and 73, world economic growth averaged 4.9%. That's incredible. And that's not just in the US, which is actually a little lower than that. It's in China. It's in poor countries like Spain and Austria. It's in Latin America. It's all over the world. In Japan in the 1960s, annual growth was 11% for about 5 or 6 years in a row. I mean, it's incredible growth. So there's this feeling that the pie is growing all the time. And that creates the sense there's peace and prosperity after 10 years of depression, 6 years of World War, and people could take chances because there's an institutional infrastructure there to kind of make things happen for them because there's money to make it happen. That's very unusual in world history. The more normal situation in terms of wealth and income is the situation that we're in today, where the top 1% or 10% own a big portion of the wealth. That's the way it was. That's the way it was in most of human history. But this is a very unusual period. So I just think those are conditions that are hard. It's hard to trace out exactly how they impact an individual life or a particular book or something like that. But they're definitely part of what makes this period unusual and makes it worth periodizing.
Absolutely, which is, many ways, this is why, Cold War as a rubric still functions for better or for worse. The other thing I wanted to pick up really, and then I'll let me see the question we have. I think we have one question.
Okay.
Is you emphasize the importance of biography, right?
Yeah.
In any historical research, and so the sort of artificial division between the commoners or the great minds or the major players in history, it can collapse when you do the biography, because I think that, to me, the interest of our biographies is not about how great these people are, but rather how ordinary they are. The
Right.
same kind of frustration and foibles and so on and so forth. Okay, great. Let me see. So there's one question, I think, from Victor Makalovsky. I hope I said your name right.
I see him. Hi. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to read the question. Oh, you can read it. Look, right? Can you see it?
No, I can't see it. You should read it.
Okay, so today, with paintings on PC screens, unlimited with host of smaller or similar looking pictures, how do you think our visual and aesthetic perception changes?
How does our aesthetic perception change because we're seeing it in pixels? Is that the question?
Let me explain it if I can.
Sure.
Well, perfect. First, I have to say that you made a perfect speech. I admire it. But today, there's been a major change in what we can see with our gadgets. When you click on the pictures, or on a picture of an artist, say Pollock, you'll get hundreds and thousands of Pollock imitators right on the right part of your screen. So it's and you can scroll them for hours. So we have millions of pictures in high resolution that can be seen in COVID situation when we don't go to galleries that often as we like. So how this really change the role of new originality getting from an artist to the audience, whenever in whatever manner he clicks the style on the manner of painting, you get lots of fake and semi-fake imitations and surrogates. So the true path of an artist as an individual representation is now much more difficult, if not entirely blocked. What is your perception of this new artificial intelligence screening of our cultural heritage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great observation. I have two observations to make in return, but probably neither of them was particularly interesting. One is just that there's so much cultural product out there, both versions of the original and the knockoffs and so on as you're describing, that it's kind of impossible to see the horizon where culture ends. There's just an enormous amount of product. It circulates all around the world. It seems limitless. It's very flat. So there aren't any politics anymore. There's nobody who sort of rises above, so to speak, becomes iconic. Everybody has to focus on. It's all flat. And in a way, in that world, an imitation politics is as good as a Pollock. So that's one response. The other response is the opposite, which is that Pollocks are still incredibly valuable. So it's not like a Benjamin situation where you lose the aura of the original by all these imitations. In fact, the original net becomes even more valuable. So a Pollock is now worth $100 million. If you there's a Pollock painting called Mural, which is one of his first abstract paintings in 43, he made it, which traveled around the United States recently, and it's owned by the state of Iowa because Peggy Guggenheim had painted it for her. She didn't want it. She sent it to the University of Iowa, which is a state university, and they have it in their collection. And the state of Iowa is always trying to sell it because they want the $100 million. So the fact that there's imitation murals out there doesn't matter. The original still has this incredible value. But of course, now the art world is all about money in a way. It's all about how much you're going to spend on. It's an investment in a much more naked way, I think, than it was in the 40s. But even in the 40s, people bought contemporary art because they wanted to make money on it. So I think weirdly, two things are going on at once. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for. Yeah, please.
Sure.
We have two questions. The first question is long. I'm going to read it out so that everybody can hear it. So the question is from Shuang Shen. Professor Manan, could you talk a bit about how you dealt with the relationship between the macro and the macro, the structural and the individual while writing this book? So much Cold War criticism pertaining to culture is focused on ideology. How do you approach the question of ideology in this study of culture history? If freedom can be considered a Cold War ideology, or first of all, would you agree, is there a coherent force that enables this idea becoming an ideology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I get all of the question, but let me see if this is helpful. One feature, so two things. I think the questioner is making the point, if I understand it correctly, that freedom is an ideological construct in this period. And I believe it's used by everybody. So spontaneity, whatever term people, autonomy, whatever term people use for freedom, freedom is sort of the concept du jour, really up until Vietnam. That's just, and it's true because it's also the propaganda concept that the United States is, that's what I say liberal democracies stand for. So it becomes kind of meaningless at a certain point because everybody's using it no matter what they're describing. It's a form of justification of whatever it is that you're trying to do or whatever it is that you want. But what's interesting, I think goes to the first part of the question, is that the individual artist is not in control of the infrastructure, cultural infrastructure that develops, that enables that work of art to go where it goes. Happens because of things outside of the individual artist's control. So that's the reason why when you talk about biography, you need to make sure you're talking about people who are limited in what they are able to achieve and who are enabled to achieve certain things by virtue of circumstances beyond their control. Second, and then the final thing I was going to say was that we tend to think of art and ideas in this period as essentially ideological because we think there's a Cold War ideology that kind of pervades cultural production. And you could certainly find that in Hollywood movies, for example. It's just a question that it's there. Certain kinds of fiction, things like that. But in terms of in terms of the fine arts, in terms of poetry, painting, music, dance, it's very much art for art's sake. That's what's striking about it. People are interested in it is what is music? What is painting? If I throw paint from a paint can onto a canvas, is that a painting? Or if I make all white paintings, as Rauschenberg did, is that a painting? Or if I compose a piece of music in which the performer doesn't play a single note, as John Cage did, is that music? What is poetry? Is poetry the voice? Is poetry the eye? Poetry the mind? You know, what does poetry express? How should we respond to movies? Should we respond to them intellectually and philosophically, or should we respond to them viscerally and sensationally? Those are the questions that critics are asking, that artists are asking. So it's not ideological at all. Now, you could say it's an escape from ideology, maybe, but what's fascinating to me about the period is that people are actually interested in these very profound questions about what is a work of art. And that ends after 1965. Art becomes very political and ideological, and people start asking those questions. We don't ask those questions today. We don't say, is it really music? They say, yeah, if you like it, it's music, you know. But people ask those questions, they thought a lot turned on it. That was really important to get the right answer to that question. So in that sense, it's not really political at all. It has to do with the nature of art.
We have another question from Kenny Young. So the question is, the mid-20th century indeed saw the global Americanization of popular culture, vernacular modernism, say, in many Asian countries and cities. Would you make some comments or your observations about this from a cultural as well as political perspectives?
Yeah, it's true that the United States popular culture was exported and caught on around the world. And a good example is actually rock and roll. So rock and roll, as I'm sure everybody knows, was a style of pop music that developed around 1955, 1956 in the United States with Elvis Presley. He went on television in 1956 and was fantastically popular because he was an incredible performer. He's also a great singer, but he was one of the great white rock and roll performers, like Chuck Berry was one of the great black rock and roll performers. And this became a huge thing in the United States around 1957, 56, 57. By 1958, people were listening to rock and roll everywhere in the world. There was an Elvis impersonator in Tokyo who sang Elvis songs in English, even though he didn't understand English, neither did his audience. He was very popular. They sang it in Jakarta. They sang it in Cairo. They sang rock and roll everywhere in the world. There were rock and roll bands of Indonesians in Holland. I mean, you know, it was the music that all teenagers were listening to all over the world. That the United States government had nothing to do with that. That was the music industry. It found a way to market its product everywhere in the world, and it caught on. That's how the Beatles happened. The Beatles were like all these other people. They were a cover band of American rock and roll music. That's how they got started. They played American rock and roll. They played it in Hamburg for a long time, and they played it in Liverpool. They started playing it in Paris. They became incredibly popular. They started writing their own songs, and they come to the United States and change American music. But so that's an example of something that that becomes a worldwide thing that it's not a state-sponsored thing. The movies are a little more complicated because the state did help the movie industry in post-war negotiations for financial assistance to Britain and UK and France, because they were, of course, both pretty much broke at the end of the war. This was before the Marshall Plan went into effect. And the United States, tied to, as a condition of giving these loans to UK and France, those countries had to lower their quota system for American movies. So France had protected its own movie industry by having a quota system of imported movies, and they were forced to lower that. So a lot of American movies have been made in the 40s that weren't seen in France because France was occupied by the Nazis. They all showed up in France in the late 1940s and had a big effect on French film and film going. So that's another case where it's basically a commercial thing that's happening. It's not a government-sponsored cultural diplomacy thing, but the government was helpful in opening that market up. And in general, the government wanted to open these markets for business. That was part of for American business, that was of course part of our Cold War policy. And so that helped get these popular culture products out there. But what's interesting to me is that pop art, which had no government sponsorship, rock and roll, which had no government sponsorship, Hollywood movies, which had minimal government sponsorship, they conquered the world. Abstract expressionism, no.
Oh, okay. I was going to follow up with make comments, but I'm warned that time is up. We need to wrap up.
Make one comment. It's your show. You can make a comment.
No, I'm just thinking about in all these examples you cited, there seems to be very grassroots, right? Kind of grassroots initiative, pop culture and rock music and so on and so forth. But on the other side of the Cold War, and the organization is very different. It really is very top down, and also on the other side of the Cold War, ideology is really the foundations of everything. So that's kind of interesting and I think this probably requires a little longer conversation and another time.
Okay.
You can have the final word and then we have to wrap up.
No, this has been great. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for hanging in there and for your questions.
Thank you.